Hello, it's John Heaton, catching up for lost time. I haven't done a video in a while, so this is another one. And we're going to review this superb interview album from the David Wigg interviews. It's called The Beatles Tapes. And I remember at the time, it came out in 1976. And it contains interview material taken mainly from 1969 and 1970. And it's fascinating primarily because that was the period when, of course, the Beatles were either about to split up or had just split up. And some of these interviews are amongst the best and most revealing from that period. And the fact that David Wigg from the Daily Express was able to have access to all four of them. And they went out on Radio 1 in a show called Seen and Heard. And this album that we see here, or we hear on this, is kind of edited versions of those interviews. I have heard some of the extended. David Wigg said a few years ago he was going to put out the full unedited version, but that hasn't seen the light of day. I think presumably because various parties objected. This is a shame. I would like to hear that. At the time, I think it was George and Ringo objected to it, but their views were dismissed and the album came out. It's got some nice pictures in this booklet, and some of which were contemporary headlines, like Beatle John asked to play Christ. He was asked to play Christ in Jesus Christ Superstar in around 1970. This picture here of them with the bowler hats is from the Morecambe and Wise show, and I just watched that clip yesterday with them singing a song with Morecambe and Wise, which is pretty funny. And that's them with Ken Dodd there. And there's I think there's pictures with Muhammad Ali, and then some nice portraits of the solo Beatles, and then probably most interestingly is pictures of Paul with David Wigg at the top there, and then at the bottom John and Yoko with David Wigg. This album is more or less one side per Beatle. Very interesting. If I had to choose a favourite side, it would be the Lennon side. There's some sleeve notes on the back which detail David Wigg's reminiscing about where these were recorded, when, a few tidbits of information of what was going on at the time. Rather disappointingly, he gets the dates wrong for quite a few of these interviews. In particular, George Harrison interview is credited to March 1969, and George is discussing the recently released Abbey Road album. So pretty obvious that interview, and Mark Lewison put it right in his books, was from early October 69. Similarly, McCartney interview here credited to March 1970. But I think again Mark Lewison puts him right, and this is recorded in, I think it's September 69. So a bit disappointing that he can't even get his dates right. But that's minor criticism, because the meat of this record is in the actual records. It's on the Polydor label. And as I say, they tried to prevent it coming out. I'm glad they didn't, because it was a valuable addition to me. It was one of the earliest albums I picked up of the Beatles, if you can count it as an album. And very interesting just to hear interviews, as I said, from around the time of the split, because they were all kind of in two minds about whether it was a good thing or a bad thing. I'll come to that in a minute. I think what I'll do is go through the highlights of each side. So John's interviews start off with him in the middle of his peace crusade, where he's talking about give peace a chance, and very interesting interview and theories about God being like electricity. You can light the room with it, or you can make the H-bomb with it. So he was kind of making the theory that God was a power which could be used for good or bad, which is kind of interesting, even if you don't agree with it. And then later on, John's talking about, it's only been since September since we worked together, and maybe if one of us comes along and starts it all off, we'll all come together and make an album. And I think that particular interview was recorded in the winter of maybe January or February of 1970. And then perhaps most revealingly is the so-called, I think it's called, nicknamed The Angry Interview, or maybe he did a couple of angry interviews from around the same time, 1971, recorded in New York, where David Wigg is asking him, you feel there's going to be a reconciliation of the group ever? And John is very forthright and gives his best ever response about why the Beatles split up in a concise 2 or 3 minute section, saying, would George have ever flourished if we kept the group together? No chance. There was just no room. By the time the Beatles reached their peak, they were cutting each other down to size, and that's why we had to break it up. And it's just fascinating. And he goes on rather sadly to say it's like a rugby team. Sometimes you have to leave the boys on a Saturday night. That's how it is. So quite heartfelt interview from John. Also saying, if Yoko is responsible for breaking up the Beatles, can she have the credit for all the great music we've made since? And then he goes on to say, I'm making more money than I ever did as a Beatle. Paul's making more money as he ever did as a Beatle. Because if you look at it that way, if you add the solo albums together, they were selling many more records. And, John makes very forthright and good points about, they were doing their own thing and not having to subsume it into some kind of group format which caused trouble. And then just warning any kids coming in the business, don't sign anything unless the lawyer's your brother. So that's a fascinating interview, worth checking out this album just for that Lennon side alone. And then we have Paul, as I say, interviewed around about the time of Abbey Road being released, very close to the time when John told the others that he was quitting. But Paul is being, I think it was just before. Anyway, they kept it a secret. So I'm not sure. But, Paul's asked about the future of the Beatles. He says, well, I don't know. When we gave up touring, we got into making better albums. And now I'm not sure what's going to happen. But it'll be all right, though, is his last comment. And quite upbeat. And he was to get more negative, obviously, over the next couple of years. But at this time, just before the split, he's been quite positive. And even George Harrison, not known for his positive comments around the Beatles' split time, is saying to David Wigg, you can't split. Or maybe physically you could split, but spiritually you can't split. Because if you're listening, I'm the walrus too. And that was really touching to hear George say that. And he's also asked by David Wigg his favourite tracks from Abbey Road, and he lists Come Together, and then he says, I like all of these songs from Paul, You Never Give Me Your Money, Golden Slumbers. Paul always writes nice melodies. In fact, I don't know where he finds them from half the time. So it's nice to hear George saying some complimentary things about Paul. As I say, don't hear that too often, but you hear it on this record. Ringo is being down to earth and saying, David Wigg is cheekily asking him if there's anyone going to get the Beatles back together, it's going to be you. And Ringo says, well, they all say that. I don't know why. Maybe it's because I'm so nice. And there's just charming humour throughout Ringo's interviews. And, there's no one of us that can say whether to get back together. It's down to the four of us. And then Ringo says, I'm not shaving my beard off for anyone. So he doesn't want to go on stage. Maybe I'll have it dyed gold, he says. So delightful interviews from Ringo, and a great story about how he and Harry Nilsson were relaxing on the beach one day, and some guy came up with a camera and snapped a picture, and Ringo said, oh yeah, just like all the rest of them. And the guy came up to him and in front of Ringo smashed his camera on the ground in front of him. And Ringo tells this story and says, it's one of those situations where you're not sure what to do, and They have a good laugh about that, and David Wigg's on good form. He's asking good, if slightly obvious, questions. You know, if I was David Wigg, I'd be asking the kind of questions he's asking, and he obviously wants the Beatles to reform, and they're not obviously they were not going to, but at the time nobody knew that. So this album, I thoroughly recommend it. I think it's available on CD, and it's nice to have on vinyl. It's one of my earliest acquisitions, and love it to bits. Thank you for watching.